In the free city of Myr, where the streets smelled of dye and salt and human waste, a boy with no name learned his first lesson about power. He was nobody. He owned nothing. He had no family, no coin, no future. But he had eyes that watched, and ears that listened, and a mind that remembered everything. The boy who had become Varys began as thousands of other forgotten children began, sleeping in alleys, stealing bread from market stalls, running errands for coppers that bought another day of life. The free cities were full of such children. Most died young, claimed by disease or starvation, or the casual cruelty of those with power over the powerless. A few survived long enough to become thieves, or whores, or soldiers. Fewer still became something else entirely. This boy was quick, not with a blade or his fists, but with words and observation. He learned which merchants counted their stock carefully and which did not. He learned which guards could be charmed, and which would break your fingers for sport. He learned to read faces the way other children learned to read letters, seeing fear and greed and desire written plainly for anyone clever enough to look. He survived because he made himself useful. A message carried swiftly, a warning whispered at the right moment, information sold to the right buyer. The boy discovered early that secrets had value, sometimes more value than gold. A merchant who knew his competitor's shipment schedule could undercut him at market. A wife who learned of her husband's mistress could be generous to the street child who brought her proof. Power, the boy learned, did not always announce itself with swords and banners. Sometimes power whispered in shadows and changed the world without anyone knowing it had been there at all. For several years, this was enough. The boy grew lean and clever, building a reputation among Myr's lesser criminals as someone who could find things out, who could go unnoticed, who never forgot a face or a debt. He slept in different places each night, trusted no one completely, and saved every copper he could against the day his luck ran out. Then came the sorcerer. The man wore robes of deep purple and rings on every finger. His beard was oiled and black, and his voice was smooth as silk when he approached the boy in the market. He needed someone young and unremarkable, he said, for a task that would pay well, very well, enough to change a street urchin's life. The boy should have known better. He had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and his instincts whispered warnings. But hunger makes fools of even clever children, and the promised coin glittered brighter than caution. The sorcerer brought him to a dark room that smelled of incense and something else, something old and rotten beneath the perfume. There were symbols painted on the floor in languages the boy could not read. Candles burned with flames that seemed the wrong color. The air felt thick, hard to breathe, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The boy asked what the task was. The sorcerer smiled and told him to drink from a cup. Just a sip, he said. It would make the boy sleep for a little while, and when he woke, the work would be done, and he would have his payment. The boy drank. The world tilted and went dark. When consciousness returned, it came with pain unlike anything the boy had ever imagined. Not the sharp pain of a beating or a blade, but something deeper, wronger, a violation that went beyond flesh. He tried to scream and found he could not. He tried to move and found himself bound. Candles still burned around him. The sorcerer chanted words in that strange tongue, words that seemed to twist in the air like living things. Then came the cutting. The boy understood what was happening, understood what was being taken from him. And the knowledge was worse than the pain. This was not theft of coin or bread. This was theft of self, of future, of every possibility he might have had. The sorcerer worked with practiced efficiency, like a butcher preparing meat, and through the haze of agony, the boy saw something else in the room. A flame appeared in the air above him, blue and cold, and utterly impossible. It flickered and danced, though there was no wick, no fuel, nothing but empty air. And in that flame, the boy thought he saw a face, ancient and hungry and utterly indifferent to his suffering. The voice that came from the flame spoke in the same twisted language as the sorcerer's chants. The boy did not understand the words, but he understood their meaning in his bones. This was power, true power, the kind that bent the world itself. And it cared nothing for him. He was a fuel. He was a sacrifice. He was less than nothing to forces so vast they couldn't even perceive his pain as they consumed what made him whole. The sorcerer completed his work. The flame vanished, and the boy lay broken on the cold stone floor, bleeding and ruined, while the man in purple robes gathered his tools and prepared to leave. The boy found his voice then, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. He asked why. Why him? What had he done to deserve this? The sorcerer paused at the door and glanced back. His expression held no cruelty, no satisfaction, nothing but mild curiosity, as if the boy were asking why rain fell or why the sun rose. "Because your suffering opened a door," the sorcerer said, "because your pain had valued things greater than you could imagine, because you were there and powerless, and that was enough." Then he left. He took his rings and his robes and his terrible knowledge, and he left the boy to die in that dark room. But the boy did not die. He should have. The blood loss alone should have claimed him in the first hours. Infection should have finished what the blade began. But the boy had not survived years on Mir's streets by giving up when the world tried to kill him. He crawled. Every movement was agony, but he crawled. He found rags to bind his wounds. He found water, filthy but wet, and drank. He found a corner where the cold stone walls met, and huddled there, shaking, burning with fever, too stubborn or too foolish to simply close his eyes and let the darkness take him. Days blurred together. Sometimes he was conscious, sometimes not. Sometimes he thought he heard voices, saw faces, but could never be sure what was real and what was fever dream. At some point, another street child found him and brought him scraps of food. At some point, the bleeding stopped. At some point, the fever broke. And when the boy could finally stand again, when he could finally walk on legs that trembled but held, he made his way to a cracked piece of mirror in an abandoned building and looked at what he had become. The face that stared back was the same. The eyes were the same. But everything underneath had changed. He was no longer a boy, not in the way that mattered. The sorcerer had taken that from him, had carved it away in pursuit of power that cared nothing for the cost. And, in its place, in the hollow space where futures and children and normal human hopes had lived, something else began to grow. Hatred. Not the hot wild hatred that burns bright and dies quickly. This was cold and patient and absolute. Hatred for the sorcerer? Yes, but more than that. Hatred for magic itself, for the forces that treated human beings as kindling for their flames. Hatred for the powerful who took what they wanted from the powerless and called it necessity. hatred for a world that allowed such things to happen in dark rooms while the streets outside went about their business, uncaring. But hatred alone was not enough. Hatred alone was just another way to be powerless, to scream into the void and change nothing. The boy had learned that lesson in the sorcerer's chamber. Raw power, the kind that announced itself with flames and blood and arcane words, could do terrible things. But it was also obvious, traceable, vulnerable. The sorcerer had power, but he had also left evidence. He had a face, a voice, a route he walked through the city. He could be found if someone knew where to look. The boy began to look. He could not seek revenge, not yet. He was too weak, too poor, too obviously a victim. But he could watch. He could listen. He could ask careful questions of other street children, of beggars, of anyone who might have seen a man in purple robes. And in watching and listening, the boy discovered something that would change everything. He was not the first. There had been others. Other children who had gone with the sorcerer and never returned, or returned changed, hollowed out, used up, and discarded. No one had cared enough to remember their names, but the pattern was there if you looked for it. The sorcerer came to Maya perhaps twice a year, stayed for a few weeks, found what he needed, and disappeared again. Knowledge, information, the secret shape of things. This, the boy realized, was a kind of power the sorcerer did not have, despite all his flames and chants. The sorcerer knew magic, but he did not know that people were talking about him, that his patterns were visible to anyone who cared to track them. He walked through the world as if common people were invisible, and in doing so, he had made himself visible to them. The boy waited. He healed, slowly, learning to live in his changed body, learning to hide what had been done to him beneath loose clothes and careful movements. He rebuilt his network of street contacts, offering coppers for information, always asking, always listening. And when the sorcerer returned to Mir, as the boy knew he eventually would, the boy was ready. Not with a blade, not with magic, but with words whispered in the right ears. The sorcerer practiced forbidden arts, the boy told the city guard. He killed children in dark rituals. He could be found at a certain address, at a certain time, with all the evidence of his crimes around him. The boy did not watch what happened next. He did not need to see it to know. The city guard in Mir were brutal men, and they didn't like foreigners who made their streets dangerous. They especially did not like sorcerers who threatened the Magister's monopoly on power. 3 days later, the boy heard that a body had been found in the canal, bloated and unrecognizable, but wearing purple robes and many rings. The boy felt no satisfaction. Revenge had been simpler than he had imagined, and emptier. The sorcerer was dead, but that changed nothing for all the children he had destroyed. That changed nothing for the flame that had burned in empty air, ancient and hungry, and still waiting somewhere for its next sacrifice. But the boy had learned something more valuable than satisfaction. He had learned that information, properly used, could bring down even those who commanded powers beyond normal understanding. He had learned that the powerless could become powerful if they knew what others did not. He had learned that in a world of lions and dragons and wolves, a spider could survive by seeing everything and being seen by no one. The boy left Mir a week later. He had no love for the city that had witnessed his destruction and done nothing. He wandered for a time, working his way through Lys and Pentos, always stealing what he needed, but never anything so valuable that he would be remembered. Always watching, always listening, always building a picture of how the world worked beneath its surface. He learned that magisters and merchants, for all their wealth and power, were ruled by the same base desires as any beggar. They wanted more gold, more influence, more certainty that their rivals would fail. And they were willing to pay for information that served those wants. A street child who knew which ships carried what cargo, which contracts were being negotiated, which wives were planning to leave their husbands, that child could make himself valuable. Not powerful, not yet, but valuable enough to survive. And survival, the boy had learned, was the first step to everything else. In Pentos, the boy who had become Varys met another survivor, a fat man named Illyrio Mopatis, who sold cheese and information in equal measure. Illyrio had lost fingers to frostbite and pride to poverty, but he had kept his mind sharp and his ambitions large. He recognized something in the strange, quiet child who came to him with whispers for sale. A kindred spirit, perhaps. A fellow player in a game most people did not even know they were playing. They began to work together, carefully at first, each testing the other for weakness or betrayal. But the partnership held, bound not by trust, but by mutual benefit. Illyrio had contacts among Pentos' merchants and magisters. The boy had an eye for detail and a network of street children who could go anywhere, hear anything, and be instantly forgotten. Together, they began to build something larger, not just information gathering, but information architecture. A system where every piece of knowledge had its place, where patterns could be seen and futures predicted, where the right word in the right ear at the right time could shift the course of trade agreements, inheritance disputes, political alliances. Power, real power. The kind that did not announce itself with flames or swords, the kind that whispered in shadows and changed the world while the world looked elsewhere. And through it all, the boy remembered the dark room in Moor. He remembered the cold blue flame and the voice that spoke in twisted languages. He remembered being powerless, being nothing, being fuel for forces that cared nothing for his suffering. Never again, he promised himself. Never again would he be powerless. Never again would magic or strength or noble birth determine his fate. He would know everything. He would see everything. And when the time came, when kings and queens and sorcerers thought themselves beyond reach, he would prove that knowledge was the sharpest blade of all. The boy who had been mutilated in Myr became the man called Varys. But the hatred born in that dark room never left him. It simply learned to smile, to bow, to whisper soft words while spinning a web that would eventually span 2 continents. And in that web, magic and those who wielded it would find no safe harbour. For the spider remembered. The spider always remembered. Illyrio Mopatis was not a man most people would trust. He was too fat, too friendly, too eager to help with problems you had not asked him to solve. His rings were cheap, gilded brass pretending to be gold. His smile showed too many teeth. When he laughed, which was often, it sounded like a merchant calculating profit. But Varys recognized something in Illyrio that others missed. The fat man was not foolish. He was not careless. Every gesture, every laugh, every seemingly innocent question was part of a performance designed to make people underestimate him. And people who were underestimated, Varys knew, could do almost anything. Their first conversation happened in a cheese shop in Pentos, a cramped space that smelled of aging milk and merchant ambition. Varys had come to sell information about a shipment of Tyroshi silks that would arrive late, giving local merchants time to adjust their prices. Illyrio had listened, counted out the agreed coppers, and then asked a question that changed everything. "You know things," Illyrio said, his fingers drumming on the counter. "Small things, useful things. But do you understand what to do with what you know?" Varys met his eyes. "I sell it to people who will pay." "Yes, yes, of course." Illyrio waved a pudgy hand. "But that is thinking like a fisherman who sells today's catch. You catch one fish, you sell one fish, you eat for one day. I am asking if you know how to stock a pond." Varys understood immediately. Information was not just a commodity to be sold once and forgotten. Information was a resource that could be cultivated, controlled, and sold many times to many different buyers. A secret about ship schedules was worth coppers to a single merchant. But that same secret, whispered to 3 competing merchants, each thinking they alone possessed it, could be worth silver. And if you knew how all 3 would react to that information, you could position yourself to profit from their choices. That was worth gold. "Teach me," Varys said. And Illyrio did. The partnership began simply. Illyrio had contacts among Pentos's merchant class and minor nobility. Varys had a growing network of street children, beggars, and servants who moved through the city like ghosts, seeing everything and being noticed by no one. Together, they created something neither could have built alone. Varys learned to think not in terms of individual secrets, but in terms of systems. A kitchen servant who heard her master planning to divorce his wife was useful, but only once. A kitchen servant who reported every conversation in that household week after week, month after month, became an asset worth cultivating. And a network of kitchen servants across dozens of households became something else entirely. It became a map of the city's private life, constantly updating, revealing patterns no single conversation could show. Illyrio taught him the mechanics of espionage, how to create dead drops where information could be left without the informant and handler ever meeting, how to use coded messages that looked like merchant tallies or laundry lists, how to compartmentalize knowledge so that no single person in the network knew enough to betray the whole operation. But more than mechanics, Illyrio taught him patience. "You are young," Illyrio said one evening, over wine and cheese in his private rooms. "You want results now, today, this moment. But the best investments take time. You plant a spy in a household when the master is young and unimportant. You wait. You keep that spy fed and loyal for years. And then one day the young master becomes a magister, and suddenly you own a magister's secrets. That is worth more than all the small profits you might have taken along the way." Varys listened and learned. He was good at listening. Years on the streets had taught him to hear, not just words, but the spaces between them, the things people meant but did not say. He applied this skill to everyone he met, reading them like the books he was teaching himself to read in stolen moments. The network grew. Varys recruited carefully. He did not want thugs or criminals who might draw attention. He wanted the invisible people. Children, yes, but also cripples who sat begging on corners and saw everything that passed. Whores who heard secrets in moments of weakness. Servants who cleaned chambers and emptied chamber pots and were trusted with keys, because no one imagined they had ambitions beyond their next meal. He bound them with different chains for different people. Some worked for coin, reliable but only as loyal as their last payment. Others worked from fear, knowing that Varys knew things about them that could destroy their lives if revealed. But the most valuable, the ones he trusted most, worked for something else. Kindness. It was a strange weapon, and Varys wielded it carefully. A street child brought him information about a merchant's affair. Varys paid the agreed price, but also noticed the child's cough, the fever brightness in his eyes. He sent the child to a healer with enough coin for treatment, not as payment, but as a gift. The child recovered, and never forgot. A serving girl reported conversations from a magister's household. Varys learned that her brother was in debt to a moneylender, a debt that would soon see him sold into slavery. Varys arranged for the debt to be paid anonymously through a chain of intermediaries that ensured the girl never knew for certain who had helped her. But she suspected, and her loyalty after that was absolute. Not everyone received such kindness. Varys couldn't afford to be generous to all, but he chose carefully, investing in people who would remember, who would tell others in whispered conversations that the strange eunuch with the soft voice sometimes helped people who had no one else to help them. It was a reputation worth cultivating. It made people want to work for him, and wanting was stronger than coin or fear alone. The network spread beyond Pentos. Varys travelled to Myr, despite his memories of that city, because business required it. He went to Lys, where the pillow houses offered opportunities to recruit whores who heard secrets from magisters and merchant princes. He reached into Volantis, that ancient city where the old blood still dreamed of lost Valyrian glory. In each city, he found the same thing. Power concentrated at the top, in the hands of people who believed their birth or wealth made them invulnerable. And underneath, invisible to those powerful people, an entire world of servants and whores and forgotten children who knew everything their masters did and said. Varys recruited from that invisible world. He built redundancies into his network so that if one informant was discovered or killed, 3 others could fill the gap. He created false identities, becoming different people in different cities, so that no one could track his full operation. In Myr, he was a spice merchant. In Lys, a slave trader's clerk. In Volantis, a wine seller. Each identity had its own history, its own contacts, its own reasons for asking questions. And through it all, he reported to Illyrio, who managed the money and the merchant contacts, while Varys managed the shadows. They made a strange pair. The fat man who loved food and luxury, and the thin eunuch who seemed to want nothing but information. But the partnership worked because they both understood the same fundamental truth. The world was not ruled by the people who sat on thrones or commanded armies. It was ruled by the people who knew where the bodies were buried, who were sleeping with whom, which alliances were crumbling, which ambitions were growing dangerous. Knowledge moved empires more surely than swords. Varys saw it happen again and again. A magister in Pentos lost his position not because his enemies were stronger, but because they knew about his debts and his mistress and the slave he had killed in a fit of rage. They used that knowledge to destroy him quietly, without ever drawing a sword. A merchant house in Myr collapsed because their competitors knew their trade routes and could undercut them at every port. Information, properly deployed, was sharper than any blade. But Varys also learned the limits of information. Knowing things was valuable, but knowing things was not the same as being able to act on what you knew. He and Illyrio were building wealth, yes, and influence in certain circles, but they were still outsiders. Illyrio was common-born, a cheese seller playing at politics. Varys was a eunuch, which meant he would never be fully trusted in societies that measured worth by bloodline and the ability to sire heirs. They needed something more, a purpose beyond simple profit, a goal that would let them use their network for something larger than enriching themselves. The answer came from the west. Rumors reached the free cities of troubles in Westeros. The Iron Throne, that seat of power forged by Aegon the Conqueror's dragons, was held by a Targaryen king named Aerys, the second of his name. And Aerys, the rumors said, was going mad. At first, the rumors were vague. The king was unpredictable. He had grown paranoid. He trusted no one, feared plots in every shadow, burned men alive when his suspicions turned to certainty. His son, Prince Rhaegar, was beloved by the people, but troubled by his father's instability. The great lords of Westeros were choosing sides, some loyal to the throne, others waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Varys listened to these rumors with the attention he gave everything, filing them away, looking for patterns. Illyrio dismissed them at first. Westerosi politics, he said, were too far away to matter to merchants in the free cities. Let the dragon lords burn each other. It meant nothing to men who sold cheese and silk. But Varys saw something Illyrio did not. Opportunity. Westeros was the richest of the 7 kingdoms, a land of vast resources and ancient houses. If chaos was coming, if the realm was about to tear itself apart, then the aftermath would need rebuilding, and rebuilding meant opportunity for those positioned to profit from it. More than that, a destabilized Westeros might need outside help, foreign expertise, knowledge that only someone with eyes and ears across 2 continents could provide. "We should expand there," Varys said one evening. Illyrio looked at him as if he'd suggested sailing to the sunset sea. Westeros? They are insular, suspicious of foreigners, bound by traditions older than our grandfathers. We would never be accepted. "We do not need to be accepted," Varys replied. "We need to be useful." He explained his thinking. They would not try to compete with Westerosi spy masters on their own ground. Instead, they would offer something no one else could provide. A network that spanned the narrow sea, that could track ships and trade and the movement of exiles and pretenders. If the Targaryen king truly was going mad, if rebellion was coming, then someone would need to know what was happening beyond Westeros' shores. Illyrio considered this, his fingers drumming on his vast belly. "And you think they would trust us?" "Trust is not required," Varys said. "Utility is. If we provide information they cannot get elsewhere, they will use us regardless of whether they trust us." It took months to make the necessary arrangements. They needed contacts in Westeros first, eyes and ears in King's Landing and the major ports. Varys travelled to Gulltown and White Harbour, posing as a merchant seeking trade connections. In each city, he found the same invisible people he had found everywhere else: servants, whores, beggars, street children who knew every alley and heard every conversation. He recruited carefully, building redundancies, creating the same compartmentalized network he had perfected in the free cities. Each informant knew only their piece of the web. No one except Varys knew the whole shape of what was being built. And then came the invitation. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne, had heard rumours of a eunuch in the free cities who dealt in information. The prince was concerned about his father's growing instability and wanted foreign intelligence, wanted to know what the exiled lords and merchant princes beyond the narrow sea were saying about Westeros, wanted eyes that his... The invitation was carefully worded, delivered through intermediaries, promising nothing but suggesting much. Come to King's Landing, offer your services. If they prove valuable, you will be rewarded. Illyrio advised caution. This could be a trap. The Mad King might want you close so he can burn you for knowing too much. But Varys saw what Illyrio did not. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. A chance to move from the shadows of merchant politics into the great game itself. A chance to sit at the table where kingdoms rose and fell. I will go, Varys said, and if they kill you. Varys smiled, that soft smile that never reached his eyes. Then you will inherit our network, and do with it what you will, but they will not kill me. I will make myself too useful to kill. He prepared carefully for the journey. He could not arrive as himself, as the sum of all his identities and all his knowledge. That would make him too dangerous, too obviously a threat. Instead, he would arrive as something simpler, a foreign curiosity, a eunuch with unusual skills in gathering information, harmless, useful, unthreatening. The night before he left Pentos, Illyrio opened a bottle of wine older than either of them. To power, Illyrio said, raising his cup. Varys did not drink, but he raised his cup in acknowledgement. To the only power that matters, the power to see what others cannot. He sailed for Westeros the next morning, leaving behind the free cities where he had been broken and remade. He carried with him nothing but his mind and the seeds of a network that would grow to span 2 continents. In his chest, in the hollow place where other things had been carved away, the cold hatred for magic and those who wielded it burned as steadily as ever. But now, for the first time, he had the tools to do something with that hatred. He had eyes everywhere. He had ears in every city. He knew how to move empires without ever being seen. The spider was ready to spin his web across Westeros itself. And in the Red Keep's dark corridors and secret passages, he would build something that kings and queens would never see until its threads had already wrapped around them. The game was larger now. The stakes were kingdoms. And Varys intended to win. The ship docked at King's Landing on a grey morning when the sky looked like old iron, and the city smelled of fish and smoke and 10,000 people living too close together. Varys stood at the rail and studied the capital of the 7 kingdoms with the same careful attention he gave everything. It was smaller than Volantis, dirtier than Pentos, less beautiful than Lys. But it had something those free cities lacked. It had history that went back thousands of years, to the first men and the Andals and the children of the forest. And it had the Iron Throne, forged from the swords of Aegon, the conqueror's enemies, a seat of power that commanded not just one city, but an entire continent. This was where empires were made or broken. This was where Varys would either prove his worth or die trying. He dressed carefully for his arrival, not in the merchant silks he wore in the free cities, but in robes of soft fabric that whispered when he moved. He powdered his face pale and wore rings that caught the light. He made himself look foreign, exotic, slightly ridiculous, a curiosity from across the narrow sea. Harmless. It was a mask he had perfected over years. Let them see a preening eunuch who smelled of lavender and spoke in a high, soft voice. Let them underestimate him. Every moment they spent thinking him harmless was a moment he could spend learning their secrets. Prince Rhaegar received him in a chamber of the Red Keep that overlooked Blackwater Bay. The prince was everything the song said, tall and handsome, with the purple eyes of old Valyria and silver hair that caught the light. But Varys, who had learned to read faces long ago, saw what the songs did not mention: sadness in those purple eyes, weariness in the set of his shoulders. This was a man who carried burdens he had not chosen and could not set down. "You are the one they call the Spider," Rhaegar said. It was not a question. Varys bowed, a gesture practiced to be graceful without being mocking. "I am Varys, your grace. I have some small skill in gathering information. Whether that makes me a spider, I leave to others to judge." "My father's court is full of spies," Rhaegar said. "Lords who report on their rivals, servants who listen at doors, maesters who copy letters before they are sent. What makes you different?" This was the crucial moment. Varys had prepared for it, but preparation meant nothing if he misjudged the prince's character. "I have no lands to defend, your grace, no house to promote, no heirs to enrich. I cannot be tempted by promises of titles or marriage alliances. I cannot be threatened through my family because I have none. I am, in the eyes of most lords, barely a man at all. This makes me useless for most purposes. But it also makes me incorruptible in ways that whole men cannot be." Rhaegar studied him in silence. Varys let himself be studied, keeping his expression pleasant and empty. "And what do you want?" the prince finally asked. "Everyone wants something." "To be useful," Varys said simply. "I have seen what happens to people who aren't useful, your grace. They starve, they are forgotten, they die in gutters while the world steps over them. I survived by making myself useful, and I intend to continue surviving by making myself useful to people with the power to protect me." It was not the whole truth, but it was true enough. Rhaegar seemed to accept it. "Very well," the prince said. "You will report to me directly. Not to my father. He is unwell, and I do not wish to burden him with the details of foreign intelligence. You will establish a network that can tell us what the exiled lords are planning, what the free cities are saying about Westeros, what ships carry what cargo across the narrow sea. If you prove valuable, you will be rewarded. If you prove a liar or a threat, you will be executed. Do you understand?" "Perfectly, your grace." Varys left the meeting with a position in the Red Keep and permission to begin his work. It was more than he had hoped for. Rhaegar clearly did not trust his father's court and wanted his own source of information, independent of the existing power structures. That suited Varys perfectly. It meant he could build without interference, at least at first. He spent his first weeks in King's Landing simply watching and listening. He took chambers in the Red Keep, small rooms that a minor functionary might occupy, nothing that would draw attention. He walked the corridors, learning the layout, noting which halls led where, which chambers belonged to which lords. He attended court when appropriate, standing at the edges, a foreign curiosity that people noticed and then dismissed. And in the evenings he explored. The Red Keep was older than it looked. Aegon the Conqueror had built the original fortress. but generations of kings had added to it, expanding and renovating, creating a maze of passages and chambers that even long-time residents did not fully know. Varys made it his business to learn what others had forgotten. He found servant passages that let him move between floors without using the main stairs. He found old storage rooms that had been sealed and forgotten decades ago. He found gaps in walls where builders had cut corners, creating spaces just wide enough for a thin man to squeeze through. And he found the tunnels. Deep beneath the Red Keep, below even the black cells where prisoners rotted in darkness, there were passages that predated Aegon's conquest. Some said they were built by the first men. Others claimed they were natural caves, carved by water and time. Varys did not care who had made them. He cared that they existed, and that almost no one knew about them. He spent months mapping those tunnels, crawling through darkness with only a candle for light, marking passages on paper he would later burn. The tunnels connected to wells and cisterns. They reached beneath the great sept of Baelor. They surfaced in cellars throughout the city. A man who knew those passages could go almost anywhere in King's Landing without ever being seen on the streets. Varys began to create listening posts. In the Red Keep, there were places where sound carried strangely, where conversations in one chamber could be heard faintly in another if you knew where to put your ear. Behind a loose stone in the hand's solar, through a crack in the small council chamber's wall, in the space beneath the floorboards of the Queen's apartments. He did not listen directly. That would be too obvious, too time-consuming. Instead, he recruited. He found servants who cleaned those chambers and paid them to remember what they heard. He found children small enough to squeeze into the gaps behind walls and taught them to listen and report. He built the same network he had built in the free cities, layer upon layer, each informant knowing only their small piece of a much larger web. The work was slow but steady. Within 6 months, Varys had eyes and ears throughout the Red Keep. Within a year, his network extended into the city proper, into the brothels and taverns and markets where people talked freely, not knowing that someone was always listening. He reported to Prince Rhaegar regularly, providing information about what the exiled lords in Essos were planning, what the merchant houses thought about Westerosi stability, what rumours were spreading about the Targaryen dynasty. The information was valuable, but not dangerous. He was proving his worth without making himself threatening. But all the while, he was learning the real secrets of King's Landing. And the greatest secret was the king himself. Aerys Targaryen, second of his name, was indeed going mad. Not the sudden madness of a man struck by fever, but the slow, creeping madness of paranoia feeding on itself. The king trusted no one. He saw plots everywhere. He had once been handsome, Varys learned, but he had refused to let barbers near him for years, fearing they would cut his throat. His hair and beard grew wild and tangled. His fingernails were yellow claws. He burned people alive. Not criminals, not traitors, but anyone who drew his suspicion. A servant who looked at him wrong, a lord who seemed too friendly with another lord. The king would order them burned and watch from the walls of the Red Keep as they screamed. He called it justice. He called it necessary. He called it the king's right. Varys watched and made careful notes. This was a king who would not last. Either he would push his lords too far and provoke rebellion, or his own madness would consume him. The question was not whether Aerys would fall, but when, and what would replace him. Prince Rhaegar might have been the answer. The realm loved him. He was everything a king should be, strong, wise, melancholy in a way that made him seem deep rather than weak. If he had simply taken the throne from his father, many lords would have supported him. But Rhaegar wouldn't move against Aerys. Varys saw the prince struggle with it, saw him talk quietly with trusted advisors about what could be done. But in the end, Rhaegar couldn't bring himself to commit patricide, even to save the realm. Honor held him back. Duty held him back. The same qualities that made him admirable made him unable to do what was necessary. So Varys waited and watched as the situation grew worse. The great lords were choosing sides without quite realizing they were doing it. Lord Tywin Lannister, the king's former hand, had resigned in anger and returned to Casterly Rock. That alone was a sign of how broken Aerys's court had become. Tywin was the man who had held the realm together for 20 years, and Aerys had driven him away with insults and suspicion. The Starks of Winterfell remained loyal, but their loyalty was more to tradition than to the king personally. The same was true of the Aryns, the Baratheons, the Tullys. They supported the Iron Throne, but their support was conditional, built on the assumption that the king would act like a king and not a mad tyrant. Varys fed Aerys just enough truth to seem useful. He told the king about real plots when he found them, minor conspiracies among lesser lords that were easily crushed. He provided information about the movements of exiled enemies. He made himself valuable. But he also softened other information, adjusted it, delayed it when delay served his purposes. A letter warning about Tywin's growing anger was delivered 3 days late. A report about unrest in the Stormlands was worded to make it seem less serious than it was. Varys was learning to play the game at the highest level, to shape events not through direct action, but through the timing and presentation of information. And all the while, his network grew. He recruited more little birds, as he was starting to call them. Children mostly, taken from the streets and trained to listen, to hide, to report what they heard. He fed them and clothed them and taught them that their survival depended on their usefulness to him. It was not kindness exactly, but it was better than starving. Some of his little birds he trained for special purposes. He found children whose tongues had been cut out, or who had been born mute, and he used them in the most sensitive locations. They could not betray what they heard, because they could not speak. It was cruel, but Varys had learned long ago that cruelty was sometimes the price of survival. He also began to cultivate relationships with key players in the king's court. Lord Quarlton Chelsted, who would later become Hand, Grand Maester Pycelle, who was older than most of the stones in the Red Keep, and loyal primarily to himself. Sir Jaime Lannister, the youngest knight of the Kingsguard, who served with growing disillusionment as he watched the king descend further into madness. Varys did not make friends. Friendship required trust, and trust was a luxury he could not afford. But he made himself known as someone who could provide useful information, who could answer questions discreetly, who never seemed to have his own agenda beyond being useful. It was exhausting work. Every conversation was a performance. Every word had to be carefully chosen. One mistake, one slip that revealed how much he really knew, and the whole web would collapse. Aerys might be mad, but he was not stupid. if he realized that Varys was listening to everything, mapping everything, building a network that touched every corner of the Red Keep and the city beyond, even the prince's protection might not save him. So Varys played his role, the simpering foreign eunuch, the man who knew things but never quite seemed dangerous, the servant who was useful enough to keep around but not important enough to fear. And in the depths of the night, when he retreated to his small chambers, he would sit alone and think about what he was building. Not just a spy network, not just a tool for gathering secrets. He was building something larger, a web that touched every level of society, from the king's small council to the brothels of Flea Bottom. A system where information flowed constantly, where patterns could be seen, where the future could be predicted and shaped. He thought about the sorcerer's flame, that cold blue fire that had consumed part of him and given nothing back. Magic was power, yes, but it was capricious, unpredictable, bound to forces beyond human understanding. The power Varys was building was different. It was human power, built on human weaknesses and human desires. It could be controlled because it was made of things he understood. And someday, when the time was right, that power would be turned against those who had hurt him. Not the sorcerer alone, but all those who believed magic made them untouchable. All those who treated common people as fuel for their ambitions. But that was future planning. For now, Varys had more immediate concerns. The realm was cracking. He could feel it in the flow of information through his network. The great lords were restless. The small folk were suffering under the king's madness and the corruption it enabled. Prince Rhaegar was beloved, but paralyzed by honor. Something would break soon. A match would be struck, and the realm would burn. Varys did not yet know what form that breaking would take, but he knew his role. He would watch. He would listen. He would record every word, every decision, every mistake that led to the fire. And when the flames died down, when the realm was ashes and survivors looked for someone to help them rebuild, the spider would be there, patient, useful, indispensable. The Red Keep's corridors had become his corridors. Its secrets had become his secrets. Every stone held an ear. Every shadow held a child who belonged to him. Varys had arrived in Westeros as a foreign curiosity. In less than 2 years, he had become part of the foundation itself, invisible and essential, woven so thoroughly into the fabric of power that removing him would cause the whole structure to tremble. The game was only beginning. But the spider had already claimed the board. The first thread that would unravel the realm came from Dawn, though Varys did not recognize it at first. Prince Rhaegar had taken an interest in prophecy, in old books about heroes and darkness, and the long night that had ended thousands of years ago. The prince had grown distant, troubled, speaking in riddles about songs of ice and fire, about princes who were promised. Then Rhaegar went to the tourney at Harrenhal, and everything changed. Varys had eyes at Harrenhal, servants in the kitchens and stables who reported what they saw. The tourney itself was magnificent, the greatest gathering of lords and knights in a generation. But what mattered was not the jousting or the feasting. What mattered was that Rhaegar won the champion's crown, and then, instead of placing the victor's wreath of winter roses on his wife Elia's lap, he rode past her and gave them to Lyanna Stark. The act took seconds. Its consequences would drown the realm in blood. Varys understood immediately what others took months to realize. This was not a romantic gesture. This was a political catastrophe. Lyanna Stark was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, one of the most powerful men in Westeros. Rhaegar was married to Elia Martell, binding the Iron Throne to Dorne. The public insult damaged both alliances at once, before thousands of witnesses. The whispers started immediately. Varys heard them through his network, spreading like sickness from Harrenhal to every corner of the realm. Some said Rhaegar had fallen in love. Some said Lyanna had seduced him. Some said it was prophecy, that Rhaegar needed a child by a Stark woman to fulfill some ancient destiny. The truth did not matter as much as perception, and the perception was clear. The Crown Prince had dishonoured two great houses for reasons no one understood. Varys reported this to Aerys, carefully framing it as concerning, but not yet dangerous. The king barely seemed to care. His mind was elsewhere, lost in suspicions about other threats. He worried about Tywin Lannister plotting at Casterly Rock. He worried about lords who had attended Harrenhal, certain they had been plotting against him. He did not see what Varys saw, that his son had just set fire to the realm's stability. Months passed. Varys tracked the situation through his little birds. Lyanna Stark disappeared from Winterfell. Some said she ran away with Rhaegar. Some said she was taken by force. Again, the truth mattered less than what people believed, and what people believed depended on their existing loyalties. Robert Baratheon believed his betrothed had been kidnapped. Lord Rickard Stark believed his daughter had been stolen. The whispers said Rhaegar had taken Lyanna to Dorne, to the Tower of Joy in the Red Mountains. Varys could not confirm this. Even his network had limits, and Dorne had always been difficult territory for foreign spies. Then Brandon Stark arrived in King's Landing. Varys wasn't present when Brandon rode through the Red Keep's gates shouting for Rhaegar to come out and die, but his little birds heard everything. Brandon was Rickard Stark's eldest son, hot-blooded and fierce, and he had come south with several companions to demand his sister's return. He believed Rhaegar was in the city. He was wrong. Rhaegar was in Dorne, or perhaps already gone to the Tower of Joy. But Brandon's mistake was not the worst part. The worst part was that Aerys heard the shouting. The Mad King saw treachery in Brandon's words, a son of a great house, riding into the Red Keep and demanding a prince's death. This was rebellion. This was proof of the plots Aerys had suspected for years. The king ordered Brandon and his companions arrested immediately. Varys knew what came next before it happened. He had seen the pattern too many times. The king would not be satisfied with simple imprisonment. He would see conspiracies behind conspiracies. He would demand fathers come to answer for their sons' crimes. And then he would burn them all. He was right. Lord Rickard Stark came to King's Landing to answer for his son, bringing with him other northern lords. Aerys arrested them all. Then, in a throne room packed with witnesses, the Mad King revealed his idea of justice. Varys watched from the edges of the room, his face carefully blank, as Aerys ordered Brandon Stark strangled with a leather cord while his father watched. But that alone was not cruel enough for the king's purposes. Rickard Stark was not simply executed. He was suspended from the rafters in his armour, while wildfire burned beneath him. The Mad King roasted the Warden of the North alive, cooking him in his own armour, while his son strangled himself, trying to save him. The throne room stank of burning flesh and wildfire for days afterward. Aerys seemed pleased. He had proven his strength, he said. He had shown what happened to traitors. But Varys knew the king had done something far worse. He had given the great lords of Westeros a reason to unite against him. Brandon and Rickard Stark weren't criminals or conspirators. They were a father and son who had come to defend their family's honour. By killing them in such a monstrous way, Aerys had transformed Robert Baratheon's personal grudge into something larger, a cause, a justification for war. The rebellion started quickly after that. Robert raised his banners in the Stormlands. The new Lord Stark, young Ned, called his bannermen in the Winterfell. Jon Arryn, who had fostered both Robert and Ned at the Eyrie, declared for them rather than hand them over to the king's justice. 3 of the 7 kingdoms in open revolt, with others watching carefully to see which side would win. Varys's network went into full operation. Every little bird was activated, every contact pressed for information. He needed to know troop movements, supply lines, which lords were truly committed, and which were waiting to switch sides. The information flowed in faster than he could process it, painting a picture of a realm tearing itself apart. He reported to Aerys, but carefully. The king wanted to hear about victories and loyalty. Varys gave him victories, emphasizing every small success and downplaying the defeats. When rebel forces won a battle, Varys made sure the report reached the king slowly, buried in other news, framed as a temporary setback rather than a disaster. He was not trying to help the rebellion, he was trying to survive. If Aerys realized how badly the war was going, he might make even worse decisions. Or he might decide that his master of whisperers was not useful enough, and send Varys to join the growing list of people burned alive for failure. But privately, Varys was making other calculations. He watched the great houses choose sides, noting who moved quickly and who hesitated. He noted which lords sent their full strength, and which held back reserves. He was mapping the realm's power structure, understanding who would matter when the war ended, and he was beginning to suspect that no matter who won, the realm would need someone like him afterward. Someone who knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. Someone who could help the victor consolidate power by revealing which lords had been disloyal, which had wavered, which could be trusted. The war ground on through battles and seasons. Varys tracked it all. The Battle of the Bells, where Robert nearly died in Stony Sept. The Battle of the Trident, where Rhaegar finally rode out to face Robert personally. Varys's little birds brought him reports from both battles, descriptions so detailed he could almost see the fighting. At the Trident, Rhaegar fell. Robert Baratheon smashed in the prince's chest with his warhammer, ruby dragons from Rhaegar's armour scattering into the river. The crown prince died in the water, and with him died the last hope of a Targaryen victory. Varys reported this to Aerys with appropriate gravity. The king's reaction was not grief, but rage. He ordered the entire city to be burned with wildfire. If he couldn't keep his throne, he would destroy King's Landing and everyone in it. He would be the fire that cleanses. He would show them all. Varys had known Aerys was mad, but he had not quite grasped the depths of that madness until that moment. The king was serious. He had pyromancers placing caches of wildfire throughout the city, beneath the Great Sept, under the slums of Flea Bottom, in the tunnels beneath the Red Keep itself. Thousands of barrels of the substance, enough to turn the entire city into an inferno. This was the moment where Varys had to make a choice. He could warn someone, could find a way to stop the wildfire plot before it succeeded. But warning someone meant revealing how much he knew, meant exposing his network, meant making himself visible in ways that could get him killed. Or he could do nothing and let the city burn. Let 500,000 people die because a mad king wanted to take his enemies with him into death. Varys chose a third option. He sent word to Tywin Lannister. It was not a direct message, nothing that could be traced back to him. But through careful intermediaries and precisely timed information, Varys made sure that Tywin knew Aerys was vulnerable, that the city's defences were weak, that this was the moment to strike. He told himself he was preventing the wildfire plot. If Tywin took the city quickly, Aerys would not have time to give the order to burn everything. The people would be saved, and Varys would have positioned himself as useful to the winning side. But he also knew he was gambling with hundreds of thousands of lives. If he had misjudged Tywin's speed or intentions, if he had misjudged whether Aerys could be stopped, the consequences would be catastrophic. Tywin came. His army appeared before King's Landing's gates, and Aerys, in a moment of desperate hope, believed his former hand had come to save him. Against Varys's advice, against every warning, the king ordered the gates opened. It was a massacre. Tywin's men poured into the city like a flood. They killed and looted and raped their way through the streets. And in the throne room, while Aerys screamed for his pyromancers to burn the city, a young knight of the Kingsguard named Jaime Lannister drove his sword into the mad king's back. Varys was in the tunnels beneath the Red Keep when it happened. He heard the screaming, the sounds of fighting, the clash of steel. He stayed hidden, waiting to see who would emerge victorious. His little birds brought him reports. The king was dead. Prince Rhaegar's children were dead, murdered by Gregor Clegane in their beds. Princess Elia was dead, raped and killed after watching her children die. The cruelty was unnecessary. The children were infants, no threat to anyone. But Tywin had wanted to prove his loyalty to Robert Baratheon, and dead Targaryen children were proof that could not be questioned. Varys felt no particular grief. He had not known Rhaegar well, had never met Elia or her children. But he noted the cruelty, filed it away as important information about Tywin Lannister's character. This was a man who would do anything to secure his house's position. That made him dangerous, but also predictable. When the fighting ended and Robert Baratheon entered the city to claim his throne, Varys emerged from the tunnels. He cleaned himself, put on his court robes, and presented himself to the new order with the same simpering manner he had used with Aerys. Robert did not want to see him at first. The new king was too busy drinking and celebrating and grieving for Lyanna Stark, who had died at the Tower of Joy in circumstances no one would fully explain. But Jon Arryn, who Robert named as Hand, understood the value of a master of whisperers. Lord Arryn summoned Varys to a private meeting. The Hand was old, grey-bearded, with eyes that had seen too much. He studied Varys with the careful attention of a man who did not trust easily. "You served the Mad King," Arryn said. "I served the Iron Throne," Varys replied smoothly. "The throne endures, regardless of who sits upon it. I am here to serve King Robert with the same loyalty I showed King Aerys." "That is precisely what concerns me," Arryn said dryly. "Your loyalty to Aerys did not prevent his fall." My loyalty could not prevent his madness, my lord. I am a gatherer of whispers, not a shaper of kings' minds. I told Aerys what I knew. I could not make him listen to wisdom. It was not quite a lie, but not quite the truth either. Varys had indeed told Aerys many things. He had simply chosen which things to emphasize and which to downplay, which warnings to deliver promptly and which to delay. The distinction was subtle, but it had helped shape the war's outcome. Aeron accepted the answer, or at least pretended to. Very well. You will continue as Master of Whisperers, but understand that I will be watching you carefully. If I suspect treachery, there will be no trial, no chance for explanation. You will simply disappear. And so the spider survived the transition from one reign to the next. He had played his cards carefully, never committing fully to either side, always positioning himself as a servant of the realm rather than any individual king. It was the only way to survive in a world where kings rose and fell, where dynasties ended in blood and fire. But as he walked the corridors of the Red Keep in the days after Robert's coronation, Varys was already calculating his next moves. The rebellion had taught him important lessons about the realm's power structure, about which houses could be trusted, and which would betray their oaths when it suited them. More importantly, the rebellion had shown him that the Iron Throne was not as stable as it appeared. Robert had won through strength and the support of great lords, but that support was conditional. The realm was held together by habit and the memory of 300 years of Targaryen rule. Now that the dragons were gone, what would hold it together? Varys knew the answer: fear, greed, and the careful management of information, and he controlled that information. In the free cities across the narrow sea, 2 Targaryen children had survived. Viserys and Daenerys spirited away to safety before the rebellion ended. Varys had known about them throughout the war. He had chosen not to reveal their location to either side. They were young, powerless, no immediate threat to anyone, but they were also pieces on a board that extended far beyond Robert's throne room. They were possibilities, futures that might or might not come to pass, depending on choices not yet made. Varys thought about prophecies and promises, about Rhaegar's strange obsessions with heroes and destiny. He thought about the realm and what it needed, versus what it had. Robert was a warrior who would rather drink and hunt than rule. The great lords would squabble over power while the small folk suffered. Perhaps, Varys thought, the realm needed something better. Perhaps it needed a ruler who understood the cost of power, who could be guided by those who knew how empires truly worked. It would take time, years, perhaps decades. But Varys had always been patient. He had built his network over years, stone by stone, secret by secret. He could build a future the same way. The rebellion was over. Robert sat the throne. The realm believed it had peace. But the spider knew better. This was not an ending. It was barely even a beginning. The game continued, larger now, with higher stakes. And Varys intended to play it to its conclusion, no matter how long it took, no matter how many lives his web entangled along the way. Robert Baratheon proved to be exactly the kind of king Varys had expected. Strong in war, useless in peace. The man who had smashed Rhaegar Targaryen at the Trident with a warhammer had no interest in the careful, tedious work of actually ruling 7 kingdoms. Within months of taking the throne, Robert made his priorities clear. He wanted to hunt, to drink, to feast, and to pretend he was still the young warrior who had won a crown through strength of arms. The business of governance he left to others. Jon Arryn as Hand, the small council for everything else. And slowly, inevitably, to the Lannisters. Varys watched this happen with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that the most important battles were fought over years, not days. He had survived the transition from heiress to Robert by making himself quietly indispensable. He provided information about potential Targaryen loyalists, carefully selected to seem useful without being unnecessarily cruel. He warned of plots that might threaten the new regime, most of them real, a few manufactured to prove his worth. And he began to rebuild his network for the new era. Many of his little birds had died during the sack of King's Landing. The chaos of Tywin's soldiers rampaging through the city had killed thousands, and street children were always the first to suffer in such times. But Varys recruited more. There were always more orphans, more desperate people, willing to trade information for survival. He expanded his reach beyond the Red Keep and King's Landing. His birds flew to Winterfell and Casterly Rock, to the Eyrie and River Run. He cultivated contacts in the Citadel, among the maesters who kept the realm's knowledge and sent ravens carrying messages that Varys made sure to intercept and read before they reached their destinations. The network grew larger than it had ever been under Aerys. Robert's court was less paranoid, less watchful than the Mad King's had been. Robert trusted his friends, and his friends trusted their subordinates, and those subordinates assumed no one important was paying attention to their conversations. It made them careless, and carelessness was the spider's greatest ally. Jon Arryn was different. The Hand was old, but not foolish. He watched Varys carefully, testing him with false information to see if it would spread, asking questions designed to reveal the limits of the spider's knowledge. Varys respected this. It made the game more interesting, more challenging. They developed a strange working relationship over the years. Arryn needed information to govern effectively, and Varys provided it. In return, Arryn protected Varys from those on the small council who did not trust foreign eunuchs with too much knowledge. It was not friendship. Neither man was capable of real friendship. But it was mutual utility, which in King's Landing counted for more. Then Arryn began investigating something that would change everything. It started small. Questions about Robert's children. Observations about hair colour and facial features. Arryn spent time in the city, visiting brothels and bastard children, comparing them to the royal heirs. He consulted with Grand Maester Pycelle about bloodlines and inheritance. Varys knew what Arryn had discovered before the Hand fully admitted it to himself. He had known for years, in fact. Robert's children by Queen Cersei were not Robert's children at all. They were golden-haired and green-eyed, showing no trace of Baratheon features, and Robert's bastards, scattered across the realm, all had black hair without exception. The Queen was sleeping with her twin brother, Jaime Lannister, had been sleeping with him since before her marriage, and possibly since they were children themselves. Every child she claimed was Robert's heir was actually the product of incest. It was the kind of secret that could destroy kingdoms. If revealed, it would mean Joffrey had no claim to the throne. It would mean the Lannisters had committed treason of the highest order. It would mean war, possibly worse than the rebellion that had just ended. Varys had kept this secret for years. He had watched Cersei grow more careless, watched Jaime struggle with shame and defiance in equal measure. He had noted which servants knew or suspected, which guards had seen things they should not have seen, and he had done nothing with that information. Until now, when Jon Arryn had found it on his own. The question Varys faced was simple, but profound. What should he do with what he knew about what Arryn knew? He could warn Cersei. That would earn her gratitude, possibly her protection. The Lannisters were the most powerful family in the realm, now that Robert had married into them. Having their favour could be valuable, but it would also make him complicit in whatever the Lannisters did to protect their secret. And Varys had seen enough of Cersei to know that her solutions to problems usually involved murder. He could tell Robert. The king deserved to know his heirs were bastards born of incest. But Robert in a rage was unpredictable, dangerous. He might kill Cersei and her children immediately. He might start a war with Casterly Rock. He might do something that would tear the realm apart again. And this time there would be no clear victor, just chaos and bloodshed. Or Varys could do nothing. Let Arryn continue his investigation, see what the Hand would do with the knowledge he had gained, and position himself to survive whatever came next. Varys chose to do nothing, and in choosing to do nothing, he allowed events to unfold that he could have prevented. Jon Arryn grew sick. It came on suddenly, a fever that the Maesters could not explain. He declined rapidly, going from healthy to bedridden in days. Pycelle attended him, giving him milk of the poppy for the pain, but nothing seemed to help. Varys visited the Hand in his final days. Arryn was delirious, fevered, speaking in fragments. But once, when they were briefly alone, the old man gripped Varys's wrist with surprising strength. "The seed is strong," Arryn whispered. "Tell someone, tell Stark, the seed is strong." Then his grip loosened, and he fell back into fever dreams. He died that night, and with him died the investigation he had been conducting. Varys knew what had killed him. Poison, almost certainly. The tears of Lys, most likely, which mimicked natural illness and left no trace. Pycelle could have administered it, either knowing what it was or believing he was giving medicine. Or someone could have poisoned Arryn's wine, his food, any of a dozen things he consumed daily. The question was not how, but who. And Varys knew the answer, or could guess it easily enough. The Lannisters had discovered Arryn's investigation. They had acted to protect their secret. They had murdered the Hand of the King in his own bed, and they had done it so cleanly that no one could prove anything. This was the moment where Varys could have acted. He could have gone to Robert, told him everything. Arryn's investigation, the poison, the truth about Joffrey's parentage. It would have destroyed the Lannisters, avenged Arryn's death, given Robert the truth he deserved. But Varys did not act. He calculated instead. Robert would name a new Hand. That Hand would either discover what Arryn had found, or he would not. If he did, then events would unfold as they would unfold. If he did not, then the secret would remain secret a while longer. Either way, Varys would position himself to be useful to whoever emerged victorious. It was cold calculation, made colder by the fact that Varys had genuinely respected Jon Arryn. The Old Hand had been one of the few honest men in King's Landing, serving the realm rather than his own ambitions. He had deserved better than poison and an unmarked grave. But the Spider had learned long ago that good men died as easily as bad ones. Easier, sometimes, because good men made choices based on principle rather than survival. Arryn had pursued truth because it was right to do so, and truth had killed him. Varys would not make that mistake. He would pursue knowledge, yes, but he would use it carefully, revealing it only when revelations served his purposes. Truth was a weapon, and weapons were only useful when employed at the right moment against the right target. Robert named Eddard Stark as his new hand. Varys was not surprised. The king loved Ned like a brother, had fought beside him in the rebellion, trusted him completely. It was a sentimental choice, which meant it was probably a foolish one. Ned Stark was everything Jon Arryn had been, but more so. Honourable to a fault, honest to the point of stupidity, convinced that truth and justice would prevail because they ought to prevail. He was a good man, ruling a good land in the north, where honour still meant something. But he was utterly unprepared for King's Landing, where honour was a liability and truth was whatever people could be convinced to believe. Varys saw the disaster coming long before Stark arrived in the capital. The new hand would discover what Arryn had discovered. He would confront the Lannisters, because that was what honourable men did, and the Lannisters would destroy him, because that was what powerful, ruthless people did to threats. The only question was whether Varys could profit from the destruction, or at least survive it. Stark arrived with his daughters and a small household. Varys introduced himself early, playing the role he had perfected over years, the simpering, perfumed eunuch who served the realm and wanted only to be useful. Stark distrusted him immediately, which was wise, but Stark also needed information to function as hand, which meant he needed Varys whether he trusted him or not. Varys began to feed Stark information, carefully selected. He warned the Hand about the Lannisters' power and influence. He suggested, in his gentle way, that there were secrets in King's Landing that might prove important. He did not reveal everything he knew, but he pointed Stark in the right direction, like a hunter directing hounds toward a scent. It was cruel in its way. Varys was guiding an honourable man toward his own destruction, but he told himself it was necessary. Stark would discover the truth about Cersei's children anyway. At least this way, Varys could observe the process, could position himself to manage the aftermath. Stark found the same evidence Arryn had found. He visited the same brothels, spoke to the same bastards, read the same genealogies. And he reached the same conclusion. Joffrey was not Robert's son. The heir to the Iron Throne was a bastard born of incest. Varys watched Stark struggle with what to do about this knowledge. The Hand was not naive enough to think he could simply tell Robert and have everything resolve peacefully. But he was honourable enough to believe he had to try. The moment Stark began asking questions too openly, the Lannisters struck. It was not subtle. Robert went hunting, was gored by a boar that should not have been able to get close to a man of his skill. The wine he'd been drinking was too strong, his squire reported, stronger than Robert realized. The king was brought back to the Red Keep dying, with wounds that even the best maesters could not heal. Varys knew this was murder. The wine had been tampered with, certainly. Possibly the boar had been driven toward Robert deliberately. The Lannisters had decided the king was more useful dead than alive, and they had arranged his death in a way that looked like an accident. Robert lingered for days, long enough to name Ned Stark as Lord Regent and Protector of the Realm until Joffrey came of age. It was an attempt to preserve the succession while giving Stark time to deal with the truth about Joffrey's parentage. But it was also a trap, because it put Stark in direct conflict with Cersei, who would not give up power without a fight. Varys could have intervened. He could have told Stark exactly what the Lannisters were planning, could have warned him to secure the gold cloaks and the city watch before Robert died. He could have given the honourable fool the tools he needed to survive. But he did not. He watched instead, gathering information, observing how different players moved on the board. He learned which gold cloaks could be bought, which lords would support Stark, which would bend to Lannister gold and threats. When Robert finally died and Cersei made her move, Varys was ready. He watched from the shadows as Stark tried to seize control of the throne room as the gold cloaks betrayed him, as Littlefinger put a knife to his throat and whispered that he should have trusted no one. Stark was arrested. His daughters were taken hostage. His household guards were killed. In the space of an hour, the Lannisters had turned Ned Stark from Lord Regent into a traitor awaiting execution. It was brutally efficient. Varys had to admire the execution, even as he despised the necessity of it. Cersei had gambled everything on a single move, and she had won. But Varys also saw what Cersei did not. This victory would cost her everything in the end. By murdering Robert and imprisoning his hand, by placing her bastard son on the throne through force, she had ensured that the realm would never truly accept Joffrey's rule. The great lords would see this for what it was, a Lannister coup, and they would respond accordingly. War was coming again, not immediately, but soon. The North would not forgive Ned Stark's imprisonment. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's brother, would claim the throne as the rightful heir once Joffrey's parentage became known. Renly might make his own claim. The realm would tear itself apart again, and this time there would be no clear victor, just years of bloodshed and chaos. Varys visited Stark in the black cells beneath the Red Keep. The former hand was chained to a wall in darkness, filthy and defeated. Varys brought him water and spoke gently about choices and consequences. "You could have been more flexible," Varys said. "You could have made compromises, found ways to achieve your goals without open confrontation. Honour is admirable, Lord Stark, but it is also rigid, and rigid things break when pressure is applied." Stark glared at him through the darkness. "I did what was right." "Yes," Varys agreed, "and look where it brought you. Your daughters are hostages. Your wife and sons think you betrayed them. The realm is about to plunge into war. But you did what was right, so I suppose that is comfort enough." It was cruel, but Varys needed Stark to understand. The game was not about being right. It was about surviving long enough to make being right matter. Honour that led to death changed nothing. Power carefully employed could change everything. Varys left Stark in the darkness and returned to the light of the court, where Joffrey was being crowned king and Cersei was consolidating her power. He bowed and smiled and played his role, the loyal master of whisperers serving yet another regime. But privately, he was already calculating his next moves. The war would create opportunities. Chaos was a ladder, as some said, though Varys preferred to think of it as a canvas. You could paint anything on chaos if you had the right tools and enough patience. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen was married to a Dothraki warlord. Varys had tracked her progress through his network in Essos. She was no threat yet, just a frightened girl being used as a pawn in her brother's pointless dreams of reconquest. But she was also a possibility, a Targaryen who might, given time and the right circumstances, become something more than a pawn. Varys had begun to think about futures that extended beyond Robert's court, beyond the immediate war that was coming. The realm needed something better than what it had. Better than mad kings and drunken warriors, better than scheming queens and cruel boy kings. It needed someone who understood power's purpose, who could be guided by those who knew how empires truly worked. It would take years to build, decades perhaps. But Varys had always been patient. He had survived Aerys and Robert and now Joffrey. He would survive what came next, because survival was what the spider did best. Jon Arryn had pursued truth and died for it. Ned Stark lessons about power and cruelty. But she had also learned to survive through courtesy and careful behavior. Varys did not help her directly. That would have drawn too much attention, made him suspect in Cersei's eyes. But he made sure she knew there were those who watched, who might help her if the moment came. He left small signs that she was not forgotten, not abandoned. It was a long game, an investment in a possible future where northern support might matter. The Tyrells presented a different kind of opportunity. Margaery Tyrell was betrothed to Joffrey, replacing the match with Sansa. The Tyrells brought food to the starving city, presented themselves as generous saviours, and began to maneuver for power at court. They were ambitious, but also careful, playing the game with more skill than the Lannisters had shown. Varys cultivated contacts among the Tyrell household, learning their intentions, mapping their alliances. The Tyrells wanted power, yes, but they also wanted stability. They were practical people, willing to work within systems rather than burn everything down. That made them potentially useful or potentially dangerous, depending on how events unfolded. And then came the Red Wedding. Varys heard about it through his birds in the Riverlands. Robb Stark, the young wolf, the king in the north, who had never lost a battle, murdered at a wedding along with his mother and most of his army. The Freys had betrayed their guests, violated the most sacred laws of hospitality, slaughtered the Starks in a coordinated massacre planned with Tywin Lannister's approval. It was brutal, efficient, monstrous. And it effectively ended the Northern Rebellion in a single night. Varys reviewed the intelligence reports with his usual careful attention, noting who had known what and when, which houses had been complicit, which had been caught by surprise. The Red Wedding was the kind of event that seemed like a decisive victory, but actually created more problems than it solved. Yes, Robb Stark was dead, but his death made him a martyr. The manner of his death made him a symbol of Lannister treachery. The North would remember, the Riverlands would remember, and someday that memory would be a weapon. But in the immediate term, the war was effectively over. Robb dead, Stannis defeated, Renly murdered. Only Joffrey remained on the throne, backed by Lannister gold and Tyrell grain. The realm had peace of a sort, the kind of peace that came from exhaustion and fear rather than genuine resolution. Tyrion remained as acting hand for a time, managing the city with competence that his father grudgingly acknowledged. But Varys could see the dwarf was being set up for a fall. Cersei hated her brother, blamed him for Joffrey's worst qualities, resented his effectiveness as a reminder of her own failures. and Tywin, for all his strategic brilliance, could not see that destroying Tyrion would remove one of the few competent administrators the Lannisters had. The wedding of Joffrey and Margaery was planned as a celebration of Lannister victory, a demonstration of power and wealth that would cow the realm into submission. Varys attended the planning meetings, offered suggestions about security, and watched the pieces move into position for something he had not planned but could certainly exploit. Joffrey died at his own wedding feast, poisoned, his face turning purple, choking and convulsing before a crowd of horrified witnesses. The boy king died as he had lived, surrounded by people who feared or hated him, leaving behind nothing but the memory of his cruelty. Varys knew about the poison, not who had administered it, not at first, but he knew it was the Strangler, a rare substance that left distinctive signs. He knew Joffrey's death was not natural, not an accident, but carefully planned murder, and he knew Cersei would blame Tyrion. The trial was exactly the farce Varys expected. Tyrion was accused, arrested, denied proper defense. Witnesses were brought forward with testimony that was obviously false or coerced. The outcome was predetermined, because Cersei needed someone to blame, and Tyrion was convenient. That he was also innocent of this particular crime meant nothing. Varys could have helped. He could have used his network to find evidence of the real killers, could have presented testimony that might have saved Tyrion. But he made the same calculation he had made with Jon Arryn and Ned Stark. Saving Tyrion would make enemies of the Lannisters and gain him little in return. Letting Tyrion fall would maintain his position at court, while removing a piece from the board that had been too unpredictable to fully control. It was cold, it was cruel, but it was necessary, or so Varys told himself. Tyrion demanded trial by combat. Oberyn Martell championed him, seeking vengeance for his sister, Elia, and her children, murdered by the Mountain years before. The combat was brutal, and ended with both fighters dead or dying. Oberyn killed after nearly winning, the Mountain mortally wounded by poison. Tyrion was condemned to death. Varys visited him one last time in the Black Cells, looking down at the dwarf who had been the most capable Hand King's Landing had seen in years. "I could have helped you," Varys said softly. "I could have found evidence, swayed witnesses. I chose not to. Do you understand why?" Tyrion looked up at him with eyes that held no surprise, only weary acceptance. "Because I was never more than a useful piece to you, and pieces are meant to be sacrificed when the game requires it." "You were always too clever," Varys said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "In another life, in another realm, you might have been a great ruler. But in this realm, at this time, you were simply in the way." "And the realm?" Tyrion asked. "Is it better served by my death?" Varys considered the question seriously. "The realm is served by the removal of obstacles to its eventual healing. You were an obstacle, my lord, however capable you might have been. I am sorry, but not sorry enough to save you." He left Tyrion in the darkness and returned to the Red Keep, where Tywin Lannister was consolidating power, where Cersei was celebrating her brother's conviction, where the game continued without pause or mercy. But Varys's plans did not require Tyrion to die. They only required him to be removed from the board. When Jaime Lannister helped his brother escape, when Varys provided the final necessary assistance to get Tyrion out of the city and onto a ship bound for Essos, it was not mercy. It was investment. A Lannister in exile, humiliated and stripped of power, might someday be useful. A Lannister who owed Varys his life might be more useful still. And most importantly, a Lannister who had killed his father before fleeing, leaving the most powerful man in Westeros dead on a privy, would create exactly the kind of chaos that Varys needed. Tywin's death changed everything. The man who had held the Lannister regime together through will and cunning was gone. Cersei would try to fill the void, but she lacked her father's skill and patience. The realm would begin to fracture again, more subtly this time, through incompetence rather than open war. And across the narrow sea, events Varys had been tracking for years were finally reaching fruition. Daenerys Targaryen had gone from frightened girl to conqueror, from slave to liberator. She had dragons, the first the world had seen in over a century. She had armies, freed slaves who followed her with religious devotion, and she was learning, slowly, how to be the kind of ruler the realm needed, or could be taught to be the kind of ruler the realm needed, if guided properly. Varys prepared for his next move. Years of work were coming together. The realm was weak, exhausted by war, ruled by people too incompetent or cruel to maintain order much longer. The time was approaching when everything would need to change, when the old order would need to be swept away and replaced with something better. The spider had been patient. He had survived kings and wars and betrayals. He had built his web across 2 continents, touched every level of society, learned secrets that could destroy kingdoms. And soon, very soon, he would begin to pull the threads that would bring it all down, for the good of the realm, for the small folk who suffered under tyrants and madmen, and perhaps, in some small measure, for the mutilated boy in Mere, who had sworn that power would never again belong only to those who took it through strength and magic. The game was approaching its endgame, and Varys intended to be standing when the dust settled, ready to help build whatever came next. The Red Keep, without Tywin Lannister, was like a ship without a captain, drifting toward rocks that everyone could see but no one could avoid. Cersei took power as Queen Regent, convinced that she possessed her father's cunning without understanding that cunning required patience, observation, and the ability to see beyond immediate desires. She saw enemies everywhere because she made enemies everywhere, alienating allies and empowering rivals through sheer incompetence. Varys watched this happen with the careful attention he gave all political collapse. He attended small council meetings where decisions were made based on spite rather than strategy. He listened to Cersei's plans, which usually involved violence against people she disliked, and he offered gentle suggestions that were ignored. He made himself useful in small ways while positioning himself to survive the inevitable disaster. But privately, across the narrow sea, he was preparing something much larger. His network in Essos had been tracking Daenerys Targaryen since she was sold to Khal Drogo. He had watched her transform from frightened child to Khaleesi, from widow to conqueror. She had taken Astapor and Yunkai and Meereen, freeing slaves and disrupting the ancient economic systems that had ruled Slavers' Bay for thousands of years. And she had dragons, 3 living weapons that made her more than just another would-be conqueror. But more importantly, she was learning. Not quickly, not without mistakes, but she was learning how to rule, how to balance justice with mercy, how to navigate the complex realities of power. She was becoming, slowly, The kind of ruler Varys had spent decades hoping to find. Someone who cared about the suffering of common people. Someone who could be guided, taught, shaped into what the realm needed. And there was another piece to his plan. One he had been cultivating even longer. A boy named Aegon, raised in secret, trained from birth to be the perfect king. Or so the story went. The truth was more complicated, more carefully constructed. But the truth was less important than what people could be convinced to believe. And a Targaryen with a strong claim, proper training, and support from the right quarters could unite the realm in ways that war never could. Varys had been planning this for years, working with Illyrio across the narrow sea, building alliances among exile lords and mercenary companies, creating the infrastructure for an invasion that would not seem like an invasion, but like a restoration. The return of the dragons, the end of Lannister tyranny, a new beginning for Westeros. But timing was everything. The realm needed to be ready, exhausted enough to welcome change, weak enough that resistance would be minimal. And that meant the current regime needed to continue failing, continue making enemies, continue proving to everyone that the Iron Throne under Lannister rule was not sustainable. Cersei was doing that work admirably without any assistance. She alienated the faith by ignoring their concerns and flaunting her power. She weakened the crown's finances through poor decisions and corruption. She imprisoned Margaery Tyrell, making an enemy of the second most powerful house in the realm. She armed the faith militant, giving religious fanatics the power to arrest nobles, which immediately led to chaos throughout the city. And then the faith arrested Cersei herself. Varys was not directly responsible for this, but he had certainly not prevented it. His little birds had heard about Cersei's adultery with Lancel Lannister and others. They had heard confessions, witnessed meetings, gathered the kind of evidence that the High Sparrow needed to act. And when that evidence made its way to the faith through carefully anonymous channels, Varys felt no guilt. He was simply allowing the truth to serve its purpose. Cersei's walk of atonement through the streets of King's Landing was the final destruction of Lannister mystique. The proud queen, stripped naked, forced to walk through crowds who shouted insults and threw filth, was a symbol of how far the mighty could fall. It was cruel, yes, but it was also politically necessary. The small folk needed to see that even queens could be humbled. The great lords needed to see that the Lannisters were vulnerable. But there was still one obstacle to Varys's plans. One man who could potentially stabilize the realm, repair the damage Cersei had done, and delay the collapse long enough to make invasion difficult. Kevan Lannister. Tywin's younger brother was everything Cersei was not. Competent, careful, respected by the other lords. When he returned to King's Landing and took control as Lord Regent, he began to repair the crown's relationships immediately. He negotiated with the Tyrells, he worked with the faith, he restored order to the small council. He was doing exactly what Varys couldn't allow anyone to do. He was giving the realm hope that it could stabilize under Lannister rule. Varys made his decision with the cold calculation that had guided him for decades. Kevan Lannister was a good man, a loyal servant of the realm, and he had to die. Not because he deserved death, but because his competence was an obstacle to necessary change. The murder had to be planned carefully. It could not look like an assassination by foreign enemies, because that might unite the realm against external threats. It could not be obviously connected to any of the current factions, because that would start another war. It needed to look like the work of Cersei's enemies within the city, or perhaps like the opening move of some new conspiracy that people would spend months trying to unravel. Varys chose a night when the Red Keep was quiet, when most of the guards were at their posts and the corridors were empty. He moved through passages he had mapped decades ago, paths that only he and his little birds knew existed. He carried a crossbow, not because he needed distance, but because it would look like someone had shot from hiding, like a coward's weapon, rather than a professional's tool. He found Kevan Lannister in the Tower of the Hand, working late on documents, trying to solve problems his niece had created. The man looked up when Varys entered, surprise registering on his face before recognition. "Lord Varys," Kevan said, "this is an unexpected visit, if you have information that couldn't wait until morning." The crossbow bolt took him in the chest. Kevan gasped, tried to rise, and collapsed back into his chair. Blood spread across his doublet, dark and wet in the candlelight. Varys approached calmly, reloading the crossbow. There was no anger in his movements, no satisfaction, just the mechanical efficiency of someone completing a necessary task. "Why?" Kevan managed to ask, his voice weak. "Because you were fixing things," Varys said simply. "Because you were good at your work, and your work was keeping a broken system functioning when it needs to collapse. I am sorry, my lord. You deserved better than this. But the realm needs what comes next, more than it needs your competence preserving what should not be preserved." He fired again. Kevan died without understanding, which was perhaps the only mercy Varys could offer. But the night's work was not finished. Grand Maester Pycelle had to die as well, for similar reasons. The old man was corrupt and self-serving, but this time it would be different. This time the Targaryens would rule with guidance from those who understood what the realm truly needed. Varys would be there, whispering in the right ears, providing information, shaping decisions. He would ensure that the new regime served the small folk, that power was not concentrated in the hands of those who used it only for personal gain. Or, so he told himself. In truth, Varys had become what he had always claimed to oppose. He had become someone who manipulated nations, who killed good men because they were obstacles, who decided from the shadows what was best for millions of people, who had no voice in their own governance. He had built an empire of information and used it to shape the world according to his vision, regardless of the cost in lives and suffering. He thought about the boy he had been in Myr, mutilated by a sorcerer who believed some lives mattered less than others. He had sworn to oppose that kind of power, to fight against those who treated common people as fuel for their ambitions. But in fighting monsters, he had become something monstrous himself. Not in the same way, perhaps, but monstrous nonetheless. The difference, Varys believed, was in the end goal. The sorcerer had mutilated him for power that served only the sorcerer. Varys manipulated and killed for a future that would serve everyone, or at least that was what he told himself, in the dark hours when doubt crept in. He thought about all the people he had allowed to die. Jon Arryn, who could have been saved. Ned Stark, who could have been warned more